son, George, has always had a knack for attracting the most peculiar friends. Even from a young age, he seemed to gravitate toward the kids who stood out, the ones who were a little different, a little off. I have countless stories about his unusual companions, but there's one that still sends chills down my spine. It was during his fourth grade year. We had just moved to a new town due to my husband's job transfer, and George was starting at a new school. He's always been outgoing and friendly, so we weren't too worried about him making friends. And sure enough, within a few weeks, he seemed to be settling in just fine. I met the parents of his classmates, and they all seemed like decent, normal people. Everything was going smoothly until the day I got that call. It was midday when the school phoned, asking me to come in to discuss an incident involving George and another student. My husband was at work, so I went alone, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he in trouble? Had he been hurt? I picked George up from his classroom, but he was unusually quiet, refusing to answer any of my questions. This wasn't like him at all. George was usually a chatterbox, the kind of kid who'd overshare every detail of his day. His silence was unsettling. When we reached the principal's office, George was asked to wait outside while I went in. The principal began by asking me about George's behavior at home. Was he respectful? Did he listen? I assured him that George was a well-behaved, kind-hearted boy. Then came the bombshell. George had allegedly gotten into a physical altercation with another student, a boy named Sebastian. According to the principal, George had struck Sebastian with an eraser during recess, causing him to fall and scream. I was stunned. George wasn't the type to lash out unprovoked, and he'd spoken fondly of Sebastian before, describing him as a close friend. The principal admitted that no one had actually witnessed the incident, but both boys had independently confirmed the details. Still, something about the story didn't sit right with me. That evening, George finally opened up. He told me that Sebastian had tricked him. They'd been playing a game of make-believe, pretending to be characters from a video game. Sebastian had instructed George to use an eraser as a KO move. But when George did, Sebastian had suddenly fallen to the ground, pretending to be hurt. Then, in a hushed whisper, Sebastian threatened George, saying he'd seriously hurt him if George didn't go along with the story that he'd been attacked. Terrified, George complied. I was furious. My son had been manipulated and falsely accused. I decided to handle things myself and called Sebastian's mother, Maggie. She was surprisingly sweet and apologetic, admitting that Sebastian had a history of behavioral issues. She explained that he sometimes acted like another person entirely and had even seen doctors about it. Maggie suggested a sleepover to help the boys bond and make amends. Reluctantly, I agreed. The sleepover started off well enough. Maggie and I chatted over wine while the boys played in the basement. But the next morning, when I picked George up, he was visibly shaken. He told me something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the night, George had woken up to the sound of whispering. He followed the noise to the bathroom, where he saw a flickering light, like candlelight, coming from under the door. Inside, Sebastian was talking to the mirror, but he wasn't calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. George froze. As Sebastian carried on a full conversation with his reflection, his voice low and guttural, speaking in a language George couldn't understand. Then, the candle went out, and Sebastian returned to bed as if nothing had happened. I was horrified. This wasn't just a case of a kid with an overactive imagination. Something was deeply wrong. I confronted Maggie, who initially laughed it off, but eventually admitted that Sebastian's issues were more serious than she'd let on. She revealed that they'd moved multiple times because Sebastian had been expelled from schools, and one psychiatrist had even suggested he might have multiple personality disorder. Before I could decide what to do, Sebastian attacked another student at school and was expelled. Maggie and her family vanished without a trace, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play that night in the basement. George has mostly forgotten about it, but I haven't. I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't picked him up the next morning, and what Sebastian might be capable of now. Story 2: The Demon in Disguise. Growing up in a Southern Baptist household, I was taught to believe in demons. Not ghosts, not spirits, demons. If something strange happened, it wasn't a wandering soul. It was something darker, something biblical. My mother, however, was different. She wasn't religious, but she wasn't an atheist either. She was indifferent. God and I have an understanding, she'd say, whenever I pressed her about church. My mother struggled with addiction and mental health issues, though no one ever called it that. Back then, some days, she was functional. Other days, she was downright unhinged. Looking back, she likely had schizophrenia or something similar, but in those days, it was just brushed off as eccentricity. One afternoon, I had a nightmare so vivid, it still haunts me. In the dream, my mother burst into my room, screaming and shaking me violently. I woke up in a cold sweat, only to realize it wasn't just a dream. Moments later, the door flew open, and there she was, just as she'd been in my nightmare. Same expression, same rage, same words. It was like the dream had been a premonition. I managed to push her off and yell for her to stop, and she left as suddenly as she'd come. The next morning, she had no memory of it. She seemed confused, even hurt, that I was so shaken. I told myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I wondered if it was something more. A few weeks later, I heard her screaming from the backyard. It wasn't a panicked scream, it was almost excited. I rushed outside to find her standing there, grinning, holding a massive, 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. This was terrifying enough on its own, but there was one detail that made it even worse. My mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. Yet there she was, gripping one like it was a toy. She motioned for me to take the snake, but I backed away, horrified. She just smiled, tilting her head like she was trying to scare me. I ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. When I asked her about it later, she acted like I was making it up. "You must have had a strange dream," she said, refusing to entertain any further discussion. But the worst was yet to come. That winter, my church held an overnight lock-in. My mother dropped me off, completely sober, and even kissed my forehead before driving away. At around 4:30 a.m., just as we were settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, circling the building in an impossible way, like something was trying to break in. I ran to wake the pastor, and when he opened the doors, we found my mother standing there, barefoot and sweating in the freezing air. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair dripping with sweat. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked on me, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across her face As she walked toward me, I felt powerless, like I had no choice but to go with her. The drive home was silent. She didn't speak, didn't explain. When we got home, she stopped in the doorway and just stared at me, her eyes empty. I locked myself in my room and lay awake for hours, listening. The next morning, she was in the kitchen, cheerful and oblivious to what had happened. "I was just about to pick you up from the church," she said, as if nothing had happened. To this day, I don't know what to make of it. The logical explanation is that she was suffering from mental illness, but the memory lapses, the eerie timing, the way she acted like a different person, it still haunts me. I tell myself there's a rational explanation, but even now, I'm not sure I believe it. Story 3. The Mirror in the Wall. My eldest son started sleepwalking when he was about 8 or 9. At first, I wasn't too concerned. Kids go through phases, right? But over time, his sleepwalking became more unsettling. Most nights, I'd wake up to find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, his eyes open but unseeing, his gaze passing right through me like I wasn't even there. Sometimes he'd mumble under his breath, words too soft and slurred to understand. Other times he'd just stand there, swaying slightly, his breathing slow and steady. I'd gently guide him back to bed, whispering his name, telling him everything was fine. He never remembered any of it in the morning. I figured it was just one of those strange things kids do, until one night I woke up to a rhythmic tapping sound. It wasn't rain or wind. It was too precise, too deliberate. I followed the noise to the hallway, where I found my son, forehead pressed against the wall, knocking lightly in a slow, eerie rhythm. His fingertips brushed the wall in time with the taps, like he was trying to walk through it. I called his name, but he didn't respond. I reached out to shake him, but something about the way he was moving sent a chill through me. When I finally snapped him out of it, he blinked, took a step back, and let me lead him to bed, like nothing had happened. He never mentioned it in the morning. Years later, my younger son started sleepwalking too. At first, I brushed it off. Genetics, right? But then I noticed the little details. He stood in the same spot in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes open but unfocused. And then, one night, I woke up to that tapping sound again. I knew what I'd find before I even stepped into the hallway. There he was, forehead pressed to the exact same spot on the wall, knocking against it, like he was trying to step into something that wasn't there. It was the same behavior my older son had exhibited all those years ago. The same spot, the same rhythm, the same eerie urgency. But here's the thing. My younger son had never seen his brother sleepwalk. He couldn't have known about the wall, about the tapping. And yet, there he was, doing the exact same thing. Years passed, and the sleepwalking stopped. I mostly forgot about it until recently, when my husband and I decided to renovate our house. We were stripping the old wallpaper when we noticed something underneath. At first, I thought it was just a stain, but as we peeled more away, my breath caught. It was an old, antique-style mirror, a mirror that had been covered up, hidden behind the wallpaper for who knows how long. And then it hit me. The mirror was positioned in the exact spot on the wall where my sons had been bumping into all those years ago. The memories came flooding back, and I stood there in shock. There was no logical reason they should have known it was there. They couldn't have, and yet, somehow they had both been drawn to it, night after night, as if trying to walk into something they couldn't see. I got rid of the mirror immediately, but I'm still haunted by the whole thing. There's got to be a rational explanation, but I can't think of one. All I know is that my sons were drawn to that spot for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it's something I'll never forget.